Hello everyone and welcome to the IFST Spring Conference webinar series, The Appliance of Food Science. My name is Helen Munday. I am President of the Institute of Food Science and Technology. Throughout this series, we will be showcasing the very best in food science and, in particular, its application through the very latest in technologies. We will be celebrating the hugely positive contribution food science and technology makes in ensuring the food sector continues to deliver. These presentations were originally part of the programme for our spring conference, which has had to be cancelled due to the current COVID-19 crisis situation. We are very pleased to be able to still bring you these presentations via webinar every Wednesday throughout April into May. I would like to thank the Food and Drink Federation for kindly sponsoring this series of webinars. We would also like to thank our corporate sponsors, Marks & Spencer, Nutraceuticals Group, IFST and Camden BRI, who provide sponsorship throughout the year, which helps IFST to deliver many of its charitable activities. I hope you enjoy this webinar and would encourage you to register for other webinars in the series. With that, I hand over to Natasha Medhurst, IFST Scientific Affairs Manager.
Thank you, Helen. Our speaker today is Selvarani Elahi. Selvarani is the UK Deputy Government Chemist and Business Manager for Food Research at LGC. She's over 25 years' experience in the analysis of food and agriculture samples for authenticity, contaminants, additives, composition and nutrients. She has successfully delivered numerous complex projects for government and the private sector and leads the Food Authenticity Network. For more information on her biography, please look on our website. So without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Selvarani.
Thank you very much, Natasha, for that introduction. Today I'm going to give you an overview of future challenges and global tools to combat food fraud, starting with a brief history of food fraud. I'll touch on the UK Food Authenticity Research Programme. Then I'll tell you about some of the tools available to combat food fraud, including the Food Authenticity Network, that I'll cover in more detail. Having talked about tools, we'll look at what the main drivers of global food fraud are, and I'll finish with some of the challenges we're currently facing. We all know that food fraud is not new. Humans have altered food to extend its longevity and improve its taste since prehistoric times. However, the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s saw a mass migration of people from the countryside to towns and created a need for a centralized food supply. This created competition and the opportunity for food fraud, and there was a lot of food fraud happening at the time, causing serious harm and death. At that time, there were no formal food laws in place. In 1800, Frederick Ackham published a treatise on adulteration of food, in which he denounced the use of chemical additives to food. This was groundbreaking work and marked the beginning of an awareness of the need for food safety oversight. Soon after this, Dr. Arthur Hill Hassell, considered by many to be the first food analyst, published articles on food adulteration which named and shamed vendors and raised awareness. The heightened awareness led to a parliamentary food adulteration committee, which showed just how widespread food adulteration was, and it caused concern that this may affect the commercial character of the country. And so the first piece of food legislation was brought in the form of the 1860 Act for Prevention of the Adulteration of Articles of Food or Drink, which made it illegal to sell adulterated food and drink. This act led on to several other pieces of legislation, culminating in the 1875 Sale of Food and Drugs Act, which, in order to protect consumers, said it was illegal to sell food not of the nature or substance or quality demanded by the purchaser, or falsely describe or present food that is likely to mislead the purchaser. Both of these concepts are retained in today's Food Safety Act 1990. There are many types of fraud, but they can be grouped into four broad categories. Subsidy fraud, which can include falsifying records to pay lower tax or get higher production subsidies. Avoiding hygiene requirements, for example, the illegal slaughter of animals in unregistered premises. Adulteration/substitution, an example of which is where durum wheat in pasta is replaced for cheaper soft wheat. Origin mislabeling and misdescription, for example, claiming that a product is organic when it isn't. So why is it important we tackle food fraud? Some people say it's not that important as it's just a consumer choice issue and it's not likely that anybody's going to die. But they're wrong. There is a lot of evidence to show that food fraud and food safety are closely linked, with many food fraud incidents causing injury and even death. The far-reaching impact of fraud was highlighted by a special UN report that showed that illicit trade is compromising the ability of governments to deliver on all 17 Sustainable Development Goals, dislocating millions of legitimate jobs and causing irreversible damage to ecosystems and human lives. This is powerful evidence to show that food fraud must be addressed. In the UK, we have been very fortunate to have had a dedicated food authenticity research programme since 1994 that has focused on the development of enabling methodology for detecting food fraud. It has pioneered research and development of analytical methods to be used as food forensic tools, such as stable isotopes, for verifying geographical origin. But at the heart of the programme is the need for methods to be fit for purpose so that they can be used for food law enforcement purposes. The programme is supported by an external programme advisor and 2 independent expert groups, the Authenticity Steering Group, which gives strategic direction and priorities for the programme, and the Authenticities Method Working Group, which assesses methods to ensure that they are robust and fit for purpose for use by enforcers. This group is supported by its own technical subgroup, which is convened when we want to look at methods in more detail. Despite having a dedicated food authenticity research programme for many decades, no one predicted the 2013 horse meat incident and the devastating effect it would have on the food industry and on consumer confidence in the food supply chain. This incident prompted multiple government reviews, including the Elliott Review on the integrity and assurance of food supply networks. The review made a number of recommendations which the UK government accepted, leading to the development of many major initiatives. So let's take a look at some of these initiatives. 2 significant initiatives in the UK have been the establishment of the 2 food crime units. The first was the National Food Crime Unit that was set up in early 2015. And following a successful 2-year review, it's been recently awarded with more funding to expand its investigative work. And in Scotland, the Scottish Food Crime and Incidents Unit was also set up in 2015 to fight fraud and unsafe practices in the food supply chain. Intelligence gathering and sharing has evolved at the EU level over the last 40 years, starting in 1979 with the Rapid Alert System for Food and Feed, which was set up to share information when risks to public health are detected in the food chain, and it works very well for food safety incidents. But the 2013 horse meat incident showed that there wasn't an equivalent for non-safety related incidents. So in 2013, the European Commission set up the Food Fraud Network to share information across the EU and other countries about intentional violations of food chain law with cross-border impact. Then in 2018, to give a focus for its food fraud activities, the European Commission set up the Knowledge Centre for Food Fraud and Quality, which provides and shares up-to-date scientific knowledge on food fraud and food quality issues. Soon, the European Food Integrity Knowledge Base will be added to this unit, which brings together available information on food authenticity issues and related food commodities, suitable analytical tools, and associated reference data. The Food Industry Intelligence Network was set up in 2015 as a direct response to the Elliott Review, which said that there is a need for industry to establish a safe haven to collect, collate, analyse and disseminate information and intelligence. FIN gathers and shares intelligence on food authenticity and traceability from its 43 members, all of whom must submit test results. This data is anonymized and then analyzed for trends, so members get the benefit of sharing their data. FIN now has information sharing agreements with regulators, and this is working well. No other country in the world has a network like FIN. There is no legal definition of food fraud, but it's widely accepted that food fraud is an intentional action carried out for financial gain. But there are regional differences. For example, in the United States, it is referred to as economically motivated adulteration. Also, as I said earlier, there are different types of fraud, including adulteration, counterfeiting, substitution, and deliberate mislabeling of goods, which can be described differently in different countries and can cause barriers to international trade. So, under the EU Food Integrity Project, the first document that defines terms for the different types of food fraud was published in 2019 by SEN. There are now many groups globally working on definitions such as SEN, Codex, AOAC, and ILSI. Additionally, standardization organizations are working on producing methods for food authenticity testing. Supply chain assurance means having good traceability systems in place from farm to fork, which is complex enough as it is. But when you consider it in the context of today's global sourcing, you can see why it is extremely challenging. However, artificial intelligence and digital approaches have the potential to revolutionize traceability across the supply chain. Recent pilots using livestock and fish have demonstrated that blockchain can improve transparency and traceability, simplify audits and inspection needs, and improve the management of risks associated with food fraud incidents. Simple scanning apps are being developed to enable supply chain checks to be more easily carried out on smartphones. Novel intelligent food labels and data barcoding also have a role to play. Commercial tools to manage supply chains from farm to fork also exist, such as Muddy Boots and Check Organic. Forensic accounting is increasingly being used as another tool to check and track food fraud within businesses. For example, mass balance checks involve the calculation of the amount of raw material required to produce a massive end product, and tracking this can help businesses identify anomalies. Further examination of business paperwork and accounting processes can highlight areas of vulnerability such as overly complex supply chains, inconsistent payment methods, and charges. Commercial subscription-based services also provide alerts and information on adulteration and fraud based on databases of historical food fraud incidents, such as Ferrous Horizon Scan and Discernis Food Fraud Database. The focus for such tools is the development of early warning systems to help predict incidents before they actually happen. Third-party audit and certification is another tool to help businesses manage their food supply chains. The Global Food Safety Initiative, which most schemes are based on, was founded in 2000 as a food safety standard with its 4 pillars of safety, integrity, quality, and legality. It now includes more explicit requirements for food fraud prevention. As part of a company's hazard assessment, food fraud vulnerability assessments are now also required. The Elliott Review said that traders and brokers should be rigorously audited to agreed standards to detect involvement in fraud and for vulnerability to fraud. An example of this being done is in the BRC Global Standards Agents and Brokers module that fills in the missing gap in the supply chain and covers agents, brokers, importers and exporters, product-related services. Additionally, organizational culture and how this influences poor practices and creates opportunities for food fraud to occur is gaining more attention. Moving on to the tool I want to highlight in more detail, the Food Authenticity Network, which was set up in 2015 as a direct response to the recommendation 4 of the Elliott Review on laboratory services. That said that those involved in audit, inspection, and enforcement must have access to resilient, sustainable laboratory services that use standardized, validated approaches. The Food Authenticity Network is an open access website that acts as a one-stop shop on food authenticity testing and food fraud mitigation, so that best practice is shared globally for the benefit of all stakeholders, helping them mitigate fraud and preparing them to be able to respond in an evidence-based manner to the next food fraud issue. It's completely free for individuals to join and takes only minutes to sign up. I'll run through some of the main features of this network. Centres of Expertise. There are currently 13 UK food authenticity centres of expertise listed on the website, with the telephone number and email address of a named expert in each organisation. Links to government-funded research reports, methods, and food authenticity surveys are included on the website. Keyword-related searches on media and scientific platforms are performed on a weekly basis and provide material for our blogs, which is curated by the team and has resulted in 636 news and 98 event posts. There are member-based discussion boards, including one on new products and services, where members can alert the network to new products and services being developed. And you can see there have been posts on a variety of food authenticity topics. There is a training section, which currently has 8 e-seminars and 1 workshop related to food authenticity. Last but not least, we felt it was important for the network to have a food fraud mitigation section to help organisations prevent fraud from happening in the first place. This signposts the user to major global services, guides, and reports, some of which I've covered in this presentation, but there's a lot more information on there, so please do visit the website pages on food fraud mitigation. Independent governance was set up from the very beginning, and our advisory board includes representatives from government, the food industry, and the European Commission. We have a broad range of membership categories, with our top 3 being regulators, analysts, and the food industry, which make up 71% of our membership. We have grown significantly over the last 4 years, and we now have over 1,500 members signed up to the website from 68 different countries or territories. The number of unique users who visited the website in 2019 was over 12,000. The website has a Google PageRank score of number 1 for the search on the term food authenticity and the equivalent on Twitter. We've been recognized at Codex meetings as being a leading example of an integrity network. The number of unique visitors to their website has been increasing year on year, from about 4,500 in 2017 to over 12,000 in 2019, of which almost 70% were outside the UK, showing the increasing global reach of the network. We want to continue to build on the growth and create a truly global network, because food fraud is global and doesn't respect borders, so we all need to work together to fight it. In order to facilitate this growth, as of 2019, the network is being led by LGC and is funded using a public-private partnership approach. We're currently talking to governments to build bespoke pages for their countries, which can be done very cost effectively because the backbone of the network has been built using UK data. We collaborated with Professor Chris Elliott and presented at the Ghana Science Association meeting in 2019, and we're currently in discussion with the Ghana Food and Drugs Authority about Ghana being the first African country to join the network. Following a presentation to the International Atomic Energy Agency Asia Pacific project meeting in Vietnam, the project is being agreed to add a number of project member countries to the network. A little closer to home, we're working in collaboration with a European infrastructure project called MetroFood, whose aims are synergistic to that of the network, as highlighted on this slide here. The network was set up by UK government and is currently supported by 6 organisations as shown here. We believe that only by governments and industry working together that we can effectively fight global food fraud. Hopefully, I've shown you that we've come a long way since the 2013 horse meat incident, and we now have many more tools in our armoury to help fight food fraud. So does this mean we can give ourselves a big pat on the back and rest up? I think you know the answer to the question is no, but here's why. Fraudsters come in many different guises. Some are opportunistic, but others are premeditated in their approach and are becoming more technologically savvy. An example of this is added water in poultry, which is a reoccurring problem because the value of the UK poultry market is a massive £2.9 billion. Chicken breast tumbled and injected with water is worth over 200 million and represents about 10% of the chicken market. More than 75% of this comes from non-UK sources. It is used for catering purposes and especially in ethnic restaurants. European legislation sets out limits for extraneous water uptake during processing. If the limits are exceeded, the product can only be marketed within the EU if there is a declaration on the label alerting the consumer to this fact. Traditional methods of adding water to chicken involve tumbling and are slow and can only add about 20% extra water. However, by using a machine like the one here that has multi-needle injection points, the one shown here has a 3-block worth of injections, you can double the weight of chicken breast in around 40 seconds. However, you need to add hydrolyzed collagen protein to hold all the water in so it can freeze, thaw, and cook properly. This is what a chicken breast injected with 70% water looks like compared to one that hasn't been treated. Before the Food Standards Agency conducted surveys on added water in poultry, labels underdeclared the amount of water, did not declare hydrolyzed proteins that were derived from pork and beef collagen. The FSA survey highlighted that almost 50% of samples overdeclared chicken content. A lot of samples had added water. Excess collagen was detected, indicating the addition of added hydrolyzed protein, and DNA from beef and pork was detected in some samples. A lot of media publicity followed the FSA survey, which raised a lot of public awareness. Fraudsters soon realized that DNA methods could identify the meat species present, so they started adding and declaring hydrolyzed chicken protein on labels. However, analysis of commercial injection powders showed that only chicken DNA was present, and peptide analysis showed that proteins present were derived either from beef collagen or pork and beef collagen, but not chicken. So the fraudsters were destroying the DNA so that it could no longer be detected using DNA methods, and then deliberately adding back chicken DNA from cheaper sources. And now that fraudsters realize that peptide analysis of hydrolyzed proteins can inform you of the meat species present, a newer label here shows that they're adding plant-based proteins to avoid detection of collagen from foreign meat species. Another reason we can't stand still is because sometimes technology or commercial practices can change, and an example of this is basmati rice. As you know, basmati rice is a product of protected origin. It is a low-yielding crop that grows only in certain regions of India and Pakistan. It commands a higher price for its superior aroma and long grains that give fluffy rice on cooking. The figure on the bottom right shows the result of 8 decades of breeding programs on the increasing length of basmati rice grains. In order to facilitate trade and deter food fraud, a UK basmati code of practice was first published in 2015, which listed 15 approved varieties. A DNA-based method was developed that allowed approved varieties to be distinguished from non-approved ones. Due to significant advances in breeding techniques, 26 new basmati rice varieties have successfully been developed since 2015. So the code of practice was revised in 2017 and now contains 41 approved varieties. The original method developed will not work for all the new varieties. A DEFRA-funded project to obtain DNA sequences for all approved varieties has concluded, from which a new method will now need to be developed. And yet another reason for not resting on our laurels is that sometimes there are geopolitical reasons that could impact the food supply chain. And in the UK, the potential changes due to EU exit is a big issue that we're trying to plan for. In the face of these uncertainties, in order to protect our supply chains from food fraud, we need to have a good understanding of what the drivers for global food fraud are. This is the subject of a DEFRA-funded project that LGC is currently undertaking. It is made up of two phases, the first focusing on food fraud drivers and the second on tools to help mitigate food fraud. We have completed the literature survey and the expert workshop, and we're currently designing the online survey which will be posted on the Food Authenticity Network in the next few weeks. So please do look out for this and give us your views. With DEFRA's permission, I'm able to share our preliminary findings on the drivers for global food fraud. The overriding factor in any kind of food fraud is obviously for financial gain. I've seen many reports now that more money can be made from food fraud than narcotics. However, in order for fraud to occur, you need someone motivated to commit the fraud and an opportunity for them to commit the fraud. This is what the literature survey showed us. Macroeconomic factors create the opportunities for fraud. System weaknesses enable fraud to be perpetrated, but it takes individual criminality for the fraud to actually happen. If you take any one of these away, then in theory, you can prevent the fraud from happening. An expert workshop was held at LGC on the 28th of January 2020, which was chaired by Professor Chris Elliott. 46 attendees from representative stakeholder organisations attended and identified 476 drivers, which were grouped by PESEL categories and prioritised. And here are the main drivers identified that could create opportunities for food fraud to occur. EU exit featured a lot, where there can be different checks at different borders and changes to standards and regulations due to new trade deals. Climate change was identified, causing perhaps increased natural disasters, disease, crop failure, floods, etc., which could all lead to supply shortages. Criminality was identified both in terms of organised crime and on a more local level where there is a normalisation of criminal acts leading to fraud occurring. Consumer demand for certain foods due to societal trends such as alternative protein sources, social influences can create such demand. Legislation loopholes, where there's uncertainty in legislation or legislation does not keep up with current practices, also create opportunities for fraud. Price pressures caused by the desire for cheap food or the pressure to reduce internal costs. Lack of enforcement due to reduced resource or the complexity of evidence gathering. Complex supply chains, and we've seen some of that in this presentation, that involve more agents and brokers due to globalization. Low penalties and the rewards are high, people are unlikely to get caught, and it can be easy to commit the fraud. Food shortages, such as the depletion of natural resources like fish, or shortages due to war, civil unrest. And pandemics, which are a feature of food shortages, but I thought I'd highlight them separately because of the current situation that we're in. And examples are COVID-19 or the African swine fever, which can cause either actual food shortages or perceived food shortages. The issue of pandemics is, of course, at the forefront of all of our minds, and its relation to fraud was highlighted by a very recent Europol report that said fraudsters will and are preying on people's vulnerabilities and committing fraud, and this extends to selling substandard food online and in the dark web marketplace, so please stay vigilant. So given these drivers, what are some of the immediate challenges facing us? As a world, we need to navigate ourselves safely as possible out of the effects of COVID-19 and remain vigilant vigilant to opportunities for food fraud and mitigate these risks wherever possible. Once the negotiations with the EU have been completed and as new trade deals are agreed, we need to assess the impact on our food supply chains. How we feed a growing population safe, authentic, and nutritious food is a challenge that will remain with us for the foreseeable future. And an increased demand for certain types of food fueled by social trends creates an opportunity for fraud. Climate change is with us for the long haul, and we need to assess what its true impact will be on our food supply chains. We're already seeing the effects of extreme weather on some crop. As well as considering these factors, research shows that more focus needs to be given to individual criminality and the need for organisations to create a culture of excellence to prevent individuals from committing illegal practices. Given these challenges, what role can technology play? With the advent of supercomputers and machine learning, technology is undoubtedly going to play an increasing role in all walks of life, including supply chain integrity. Over the last decade, we've seen increasing demand for more point-of-use testing, moving away from solely laboratory-based testing. And with the invention of devices like the SIO, the world's first pocket-sized connected microspectrometer, these demands are being realized. There are more and more applications aimed directly at consumers, giving rise to the concept of the consumer as analyst, and we will need to assess what the ramifications of this will be for both the consumers themselves, especially for those people suffering from a food allergy or intolerance, and for analytical scientists like myself. We are also seeing a shift away from targeted analysis, where you are looking for known analytes, towards fingerprinting methods that capture the chemical signature of samples and are known as untargeted analysis. The introduction of next generation sequencing into the food sector has the potential to revolutionize food authenticity testing, but along with that comes a lot of validation still to be done. No matter what new approaches are adopted, we need to continue our efforts to validate and standardize methods that are reliable and fit for purpose so that they can be applied in laboratories across the world to obtain equivalent results, facilitating global trade. Our ultimate aim is to make organizations, countries, and eventually global supply chains as inhospitable as possible to food fraud, making them more secure so that ultimately consumers can have greater trust in the food they buy. We've come a long way since the 2013 horse meat incident, so if we continue to work together in a multi-systems, international, collaborative manner, then I'm sure we can improve the integrity of our food supply chains. I'd like to thank the Food Authenticity Network funders, my colleagues Mark Wolf, who's the Secretary, Steve Ellison, Felicia Golden, Gary Bird, our advisory board, especially the Chair, Sterling Crew, the Elliott Review team, and thank you all for joining me today.
Thank you, Selvarani. It's a really interesting and enlightening presentation. Much appreciated. We're moving on to the Q&A session now. So just a reminder to all the attendees, if you'd like to submit a question, those of you who haven't already, there is a Q&A function in the middle of your screen. So moving on to our first question. It's great to see the Authenticity Network growing globally, but have you secured enough funding to continue to operate in an open access basis?
Thank you very much, Natasha, for that question. Yes, we've been very fortunate that we secured funding for a further 3 years from BEIS, which is the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, which allows us to operate the network on an open access basis until the end of March 2023, which means it will be free for people to access all across the world while we continue to grow internationally.
That's great news. You mentioned the DEFRA phase project. Just wondered when the report is likely to be published.
Well, we started that project in around June 2019, and it's due to be completed by September 2020 this year.
Look forward to reading that. We've got questions related to that. The first one is whether students can take part and participate in that project.
Well, actually, it's a good point. The next phase of the project is to develop an online survey, which we're currently in the process of doing, which will be posted onto the Food Authenticity Network, so that we can just check the output of both the literature search and the workshop, and get wider views. So as I said, the membership now for the network is over 1,500 from 68 countries. So it would be really, really useful to get views from people across the world from the different membership categories to see how food fraud is sort of affecting them and what they feel are there maybe local drivers that motivate people to commit fraud in other countries that are different from the drivers that we see here in the UK and Europe.
Okay. So linked with that is the point about the fraudsters being quite sophisticated now. Do we have any insight into where they're getting their know-how and equipment from?
Fortunately, we don't seem to have that level of intelligence in terms of where they're getting the information from. Certainly, we know that there are many types, but there are types that are completely premeditated, and they do have access to technical information. On the Food Authenticity website, we've posted a number of articles now saying that mafia groups in Italy have moved out of narcotics into the food sector because everybody eats food, not everybody does drugs, and there's a lot more money to be made there. So if that's true and there is that level of money to be made in food fraud, you can see they'll be able to purchase those services, and they'll be able to purchase, technical services just like anybody else can.
That's a worry.
Yeah, it's a worry. I'm not sure what we can do about it, but it's a fact that they are technologically savvy, and so as soon as you publish a new approach, then they're working to try and see how they can tamper with that by mixing different components. For example, even in the basmati rice with the DNA method, they realized that if you had mixtures of basmati, it was harder for the DNA method to detect it. So that made life for analysts more difficult. That's why this is a sort of continual evolution. Nothing's ever going to stop still. Food fraud will never go away, and we'll always have to keep developing new methodologies to keep hopefully ahead of the fraudsters, or at least on par with them.
That's true. So given the current pandemic, with the market being disrupted in terms of the drivers you mentioned, such as price and supply, do you expect to see more authenticity problems of the type that you mentioned, or new ones even?
Yeah, definitely. And I think everyone's really concerned about this. I referred to at the end of my presentation on the recent Europol report that came out on the 17th of April, which is on the network, that says that, counterfeiting, we've already seen it with, false medicines and false, antibacterials that are being sold to people. But this is being extended to food, with people selling, fraudulent food or misdescribed food or unfit food from dark kitchens. And that's a real concern. I haven't personally seen any instances of it happening at the moment, but we are all aware that if there is a big demand for something, that gives opportunity for fraud. Backed up by the Europol report, there was the anti-counterfeiting group, which is a UK cross-industry group that's also produced an article recently warning people that fraud's very likely to be happening in the food sector. And in preparation for that, I should have added that the Food Authenticity Advisory Board have convened an extraordinary meeting on the 6th of May. So we're looking at the intelligence around food fraud, the likelihood of it happening, and thinking about sort of producing maybe a short guide to help businesses counteract these effects in the current situation.
Okay, thank you. So new concerns going forward in the near future. You mentioned about added water in chicken. Do you see already information about current frauds that are likely to appear?
It's very hard to predict what the next big food fraud incident is going to be. And as I said, in the UK, we're very fortunate. We have a dedicated food authenticity program that not many countries in the world have. We've had one for about 30 years. Even if you have such a program, it's very hard to know what the next incident is going to be. But having looked back at history, one thing we know for sure is that food fraud is not new. It does reoccur. And if you look at a lot of the media reports, it's usually the same sorts of foods that you get the fraud happening in. So it's meat, fish, coffee, honey, rice, things that are high value or consumed in high volume. So I think we can learn from that, from how the board happened, and put in place mitigation strategies for all these sort of commonly adulterated food, and that would be a good start. I mentioned the horizon scanning tools that are available commercially, and the focus for these tools really is to build in now extra data such as price, trade price data and harvest data, so that they can become a bit more predictive. So at the moment they look at historical events and say, look, this happened in olive oil, for example, so this is what you should do. But alongside that, they're trying to make it more current and say, well, there was a bad harvest here, or the price of something has gone up, so there's likely to be fraud in this area, and make it a little bit more predictive. But it's a very challenging thing to do.
Yeah, that will be useful. There's a question more from a consumer angle about whether people can detect adulteration in their home environment.
I think it's very difficult to do in a home environment. I think if you are buying from a news source, you should be wary, or if the price is very low when you've regularly bought something for say £3 or £4 and suddenly you're getting it for £1 or £2, that should make you slightly suspicious as to why suddenly the price has halved. So I think it's just buying maybe locally from people that you know, but it's very hard to do in a home environment. But just sort of trust your instincts, and if the price is low, there's usually a good reason to suspect that there might not be there might be something wrong. Not always, but it can be difficult to predict that from a personal consumer basis.
Yeah, so that's a good idea for people to keep an eye on that, but relying more on the sophisticated analysis. So the question is linked to any recommended training workshops for people to be able to do that?
From some analytical point of view, so on the network, we have a training page that I touched on very briefly, and there are many e-seminars there on different analytical techniques on how to spot food fraud. But that's more from an analytical scientist point of view. So we do a lot of training there, and that's available on an open access basis.
Thank you. So going back to your point about FIN, the Food Industry Intelligence Network, can anyone be a member of that?
Yes, any organisation that conducts testing on samples can become a member. So you, the two criteria is that you pay an annual fee, which I believe is around £3,000 a year, and then you must submit your analytical test data. So the basis of FIN is that everybody submits their analytical test data, the data is pooled, anonymised, and then data mined for trends. And the organisations that are currently members, I can't speak of it highly enough, because it allows them to get intelligence from other people's testing data. So then they are able to then think about their testing strategy for the forthcoming years, and some have even changed it. So for example, a lot of people have been doing meat testing since the horse meat incident, which shows that the level of fraud in the meat sector has gone down since the 2013 incident. So maybe they said they could focus on something else, for example. So it's a good way of getting shared intelligence.
Definitely, or pulling together. Makes a lot of sense. So lots of questions about the Food Authenticity Network, you'll be pleased to hear. So the first one is, how will Brexit impact the work of FAN?
I mean, nobody truly knows what the true impact of Brexit is going to be until we know what the negotiations are, how they've concluded, and what sort of new trade deals are coming along. So from a food authenticity network point of view, I think food fraud, as I said, has been around since human beings have been around. And so our work, I think, will continue, and maybe some of the trade deals where the regulations are different between the different countries might make us focus in certain areas. But I think food fraud is global; it's not going to go away. So I don't expect our work to change, after Brexit.
So minimal impact. That's good to hear. There's individual questions about whether an analyst themselves can be part of the network and whether an academic can.
Anybody can be a member of the network. All you have to do is click on the join, sign up page, and you'll be asked about 6 questions and asked to select yourself in a number of categories, only so we can see who the network's being beneficial to. It's completely free for anyone to join, and it takes a couple of minutes. So if you enter the website, on the top right-hand corner, there's a Become a Member button, and from there it just takes a few minutes to join. So academics, students, anybody can join.
Everyone's welcome. That's good. And just linking the two topics, really, how do FAN and FIN work together in practice?
Yeah, so we work well together. I presented at their technical subgroup, and as I said, that we have funding from BAYS to allow the basic network, but in order for us to grow globally, we need industry supporters or other organisations to support us. And I'm very pleased to say that FIN has started supporting the Food Authenticity Network as a supporter with a small financial contribution as of April 2020. And we hope that will be an ongoing relationship where we can provide them with sort of technical advice on food authenticity testing and food fraud mitigation, and work together that way, because both are really sister initiatives from the Elliott Review.
Yeah. So this is a question about terminology. So the difference between food fraud and food defence.
I think I touched on this in my presentation, that people across the world call things, fraud very differently based on where they are. So, I mean, food defence is thinking about it from a company point of view, where you want to protect the food and stop food fraud from happening. But as I said, most people agree that fraud is when something is substituted or misdescribed for economic gain. So they're all variations of the same thing. And this is why the work that I talked about on standardization on definitions is very important, because if we can agree those terms globally, then we can talk in the same language, and that will help facilitate global trade.
Okay, so with less local authority sampling, do you think there's a greater chance of food fraud?
Well, the Food Standards Agency conducted a number of reviews last year, and it's working through all of the recommendations for those reviews. One of those was on sampling, that did acknowledge that our skills and capability at local authority level is not where we would like it to be. There are some good positives from that review, but the Food Standards Agency is actively working in that area to see what it can do. And then on top of that, you have issues related with Brexit, and depending on the deal that we get, whether we have to protect our own borders or whether we will still have access to European systems is all a bit of an unknown. So clearly, yeah, if you do less surveillance, you're going to pick less things up. I don't think that means that there's more or less fraud. It's just your ability to detect those at different levels. So I think watch this space and see what happens out of the Food Standards Agency review outcomes.
Okay, good advice. So this specific question is about away from the analytical labs themselves. Is there research going on to produce testing kits or machines that can be used in the field for more immediate intelligence gathering or enforcement? And what types of technology would those be?
Yes, definitely. As I said in the presentation, there's a big focus now on point of use devices. So we acknowledge that there's a role for them in the world. So you have expensive kits in laboratories that are doing jobs for confirmation, but people have been crying out for sort of screening tools. So there are a number of projects that are happening at the moment. The International Atomic Energy Agency under Simon Kelly, they're running a deployable technologies project that's looking at devices like the SIO that I mentioned, and IAEA and Queen's University Belfast under Professor Elliott conducted an interlaboratory trial using the SIO for herbs and spices, and the initial results are promising. That was multi-country, multi-lab, and basically it's a small device that you just point the sample over, and in a few seconds it uploads the data to the cloud, where there is a database behind that then gives you an answer back in a few seconds to say whether the sample is authentic or not, compared to the authentic samples in the library. We're also conducting a project for DEFRA on point of use devices, where we are assessing a number of different technologies to look at for use at point of use, point of test. There are lots of different terminologies here again, but really to act as a triage system, so you can screen out samples and then select some maybe what you would consider to be high risk, that can then be sent on to laboratories for further confirmatory testing.
So both broadening the net and speeding up the information gathering.
Yes.
Thank you. So do you think that more public awareness of food fraud would be helpful or hinder tackling it? And also linked with that is in the US, it's treated as bioterrorism threat. So would that lead to more effective enforcement or less, do you think?
Well, I think the media also always has a role to play in how the public perceives these incidents, and we've had instances of it not being communicated very well at all, such as BSE, and we never really recovered from that. Even the Sudan Red. So we work at LGC with the Science Media Centre, who believe in sort of responsible science journalism, and so I think the media always has a role to play in this, but it's very difficult to know how that will actually affect the public perception. But I think you hear, every day, I mean, that's, if you look at the news items on the Food Authenticity website, every day you get hundreds of hits on some sort of fraud being perpetrated around the world, and that's not going to change. In terms of bioterrorism, terrorism can come in all sorts of forms, and you could use food as one of those. I'm not sure exactly if it would be food fraud. I think I saw another question about somebody asking instances of where food fraud has killed people. And in the 2015 adulterated spices incident that came over from sort of North America, there was a question of whether it was almond or mahaleb in paprika and cumin. And obviously, if you have a food allergy to one of the to almonds, and you'd had some of this food, then that could have killed you.
So I don't want to put you on the spot because you might not have this information to hand, but there's a question around the monetary value, the estimated cost of food fraud in Europe.
There's lots of different figures that are floated. I think 40 billion around the world, I think, is a figure that I've heard. I don't know how you can quite get real figures for this, but it's billions of pounds or dollars across the world that it costs organizations and countries. And as I said, the link to the fact that if you have fraud in a country, it takes the money out of legitimate sources, so out of companies, out of governments, and stops them from doing public good and providing basic necessities. Obviously, in developed countries, we're lucky enough to have a lot of the amenities that we're entitled to as human beings, but in developing countries, you can see how fraud would really strip out money from those governments being able to supply, food, clean water, and education to people.
So thinking about the relationship between customers and manufacturers, how can suppliers of technical support ensure that new customers are not asking for information that will enable fraud?
Sometimes people might be providing technical information and not being aware that it's going to be used for fraudulent purposes. So if a sample was, and sometimes, industry do analyze competitor samples to see what's in it. So for example, people could just submit samples blind and get a test result and do whatever they like with that test result. But I think something that's of growing importance in sort of the audit and certification field is this concept of company culture, and how the culture within a company affects the individuals within it and their ability, or their thought processes in terms of whether they should commit fraud or not. So creating a culture of excellence where all employees have similar thinking and want the best for their company and for their products is a good way of ensuring that you sort of stamp out the fraudulent activities that could go on in companies. Also, sort of normalization of fraudulent or illegal practices is something that's coming up, where people will say, I might have to make 20 people redundant, but if we take this shortcut, then that's okay, because it's, if you substitute a product that's not unsafe, but just might be a slightly inferior quality, you say, well, you're not harming anybody and I'm saving 20 jobs. So I think there is this normalization of illegal practice that goes on in some cultures. So company culture and organizational culture, I think, is something that people are focusing on now.
Okay, it's good to have that clarification. So I'm going to move on to the last question, Selvarani, unless you've spotted one on the incoming list that you would like to answer, because we're running out of time, unfortunately. The question I'd spotted was about the Muddy Boots software and whether it was for portable or handheld devices, downloadable for free.
Muddy Boots is not free as far as I know, and it's an end-to-end supply chain management system that allows all the different actors in your supply chain to be able to upload data to the cloud at various points, so helping form that secure supply chain. But it's not free, but there is information and a link on the website that you can link through to their website and find out more information.
Thank you. So I'll draw the Q&A session to a close, and thank you again, Selvarani, for all your hard work in preparing for today and running this excellent presentation and live Q&A. And also thank you to everyone from across the globe for attending our IFST webinar today. And if you didn't manage to answer your questions, you can contact Selvarani directly. We'll aim to share a recording of the webinar, including the Q&A session, to everyone who attended today via email and also on our website within 5 working days. But firstly, I'd like to recommend to you, though, for those of you who are not familiar with IFST, that you can find really useful resources on our website, including our brand new COVID-19 Knowledge Hub, which is continually being updated, and also our online Food Science and Technology FS&T magazine, just to name but a few. So we welcome new members, so please check our membership benefits page on our website, www.ifst.org. Thank you very much.